For those that don't know me, Air Commodore Wade Evans, Director General Explosive Ordnance. You've heard my name a few times already. I'm not down to give a speech until tomorrow afternoon, so I'll keep my powder dry in that instance. We've come to the plenary session, which is the opportunity, I guess, to ask questions of the majority of our guest speakers who've very generously, given their time in preparing their presentation and then just coming up and delivering that presentation. If we don't get enough questions, I'm going to give them weapons free to start asking you questions, and we'll see how we go after that. I know Nigel, well, I typically keep him on a reasonably tight leash, but I'm happy to let him go, and we'll see what happens. So we've got some floor walkers out there with microphones, is that right? Yep, excellent. So we'll open it up for questions, please.
Good afternoon, Tony Heron from Canada. I work for Gilles. As I've got a very short attention span, my question is going to be for Nigel because he was the last person speaking. Do you actually have a definition for a competent person?
Well, yeah, my panel members here are trying to encourage me to say yes, but it wouldn't be 100% true. It's part of our next part of the next phase is to explore that in more detail. So the short answer is yes, in part. It's only partial, I would say, and it's an area that we should explore a bit more. However, I would be really careful that we don't try and define that so tightly that we tie ourselves in knots. So there might be a temptation to say you must have the following qualifications and you must have these competencies and very prescriptive, but as you've probably seen, my general view is that you can get yourself in a bit of strife if you get too specific. So the broad answer is yes, and I'm happy to share with you our work to date, but more work to do. How'd I go? Did I have to answer that all right? That's true, thanks. Yeah, so while we may not have fully defined the perfectly competent person, that doesn't mean we can't recognise the absence of competence. And so that's part of our journey that we're going on. Yep.
I wonder if you might pass the mic to Bob, because I know the UK have been doing a lot of work on the SSG and all that sort of stuff about...
Yeah, well, I think that competence, and I'm sure legal will back me up on this, will be tested when something goes wrong in court afterwards. But in the UK, we have a term that we call SQEP, S-Q-E-P, and what that stands for is suitably qualified and experienced personnel. So for each post, and that includes all of the posts that people sitting in this room, we have a post skills profile that is the expectations for the individuals within that post. Each individual that fills the post then has a personal skills profile. And when they come into post, they may not have all of the qualifications required, and they may not have the level of experience, but they're at a baseline that you can accept a certain degree of risk with. And what that does is that then identifies the training and development needs for that individual. So we base ourselves using SQEP, and I can tell you now that I talked about annual reports. All of the 6 regulators within the Ministry of Defence in the UK have identified the lack of SQEP as a strategic risk, and that has been referred up to the Secretary of State for Defence. So the first thing he's going to come back and say is, so what are you doing about it? And within the explosive community in the UK, we have the Sector Skills Strategy Group, where the industry gets together with academia, gets together with the Ministry of Defence, and they look at initiatives and ways of maintaining SQEP within the UK and sustaining that. So they've just developed a very good apprentice program for succession planning and also other training programs. So SQEP is what we use, and a person is is assumed to be competent if they've met all of the SQEP requirements for the post and for what they're supposed to be delivering. Okay. Oh yeah, it's close.
I just want to add something. Agree that all makes sense. But when you're dealing with the complexity of mission systems that we're talking about, you're never going to create one person who is the competent person for absolutely everything that we're dealing with here. So we have to think about a strategy that is about getting the skill sets and having them not necessarily all living in the same place, but knowing how we can access the skill sets for meeting that SQEP for the particular issues that we're dealing with and hazards and risks and what's known about the control measures in those contexts. So that is part of the process I'm sure you're going through. No one wants to hold the mic. Did you notice that? It's like, oh, it's hot.
I just add a couple of observations for that. I think back to various performance grading I've seen through my career, and competent is sort of about there sometimes in performance domains. And I think that's probably attempt to get towards a SQEP, if I pronounce it properly, but that type of approach, you are not going to find an expert across the entire system of systems that you're dealing with, but you certainly do need a workable level, and that's what the SQEP is getting to within the Air Warfare Centre, and it's taken from our fighter force. We talk about more a cultural approach to this, and that's looking for qualities in people such that they are humble, knowledgeable and approachable. That's an important, I guess, set of characteristics for people who you can then trust and rely on to know what they're on about, understand the things that they can be expert in and where they need to reach across and fill in those knowledge gaps from elsewhere within the organisation.
Bob Seddon from the UK. The opening paragraph of the accident investigation report into the loss of the space shuttle Columbia said that complex systems fail in complex ways. Now, increasingly, explosive ordnance is used in the context of some very complex systems. We've got multiple platforms, target mensuration systems, tactical data links. We've got third-party acquisition of targets, and all of the associated problems with acquiring a proper target, of which the functioning of the explosive ordnance is but one small part. Now, does the panel think that our current focus on the EO component is sufficient to guarantee safety in the context of much more complex systems?
I got left with the microphone, so I'll give the first attempt to respond. I think that's an interesting thing, and I'm not sure I agree with the concept, by the way, that complex systems fail in complex ways. I think that might be attempting to, I don't know, find some excuse, because if you study both of the space shuttle incidents, they failed in pretty simple ways, right? One was an O-ring and one was a tile, right? So nothing really complex about the actual failure. The complexity perhaps was in the organisational failings that led to those, mechanical failings. However, to your specific question, I think the answer is absolutely, and as I tried to say, explosive safety is but one element of your overall system. And taking a systems of systems approach is exactly where we need to be. And explosives or explosive ordnance or the whole munition is only ever a part of a larger system of systems. And understanding that system of systems context, particularly, and those of us in the white and light blue will have probably some first-hand experience with this. We're using someone else's data, track data, we're firing off someone else's information, potentially firing someone else's weapon. Those systems as systems become much more complicated. So to me, that makes it even more important that the munition part of that system we have plenty of confidence in. Because the complexity, you're right, is going to be bigger than that.
I think the complexity around the munitions or the EO component should be centered around the SQ process. And I refer to Nigel's slide where he had the EO item itself, the environment in which it's being used, and the processes that are being applied to it. That is your system of systems for the EO. And if you use the item outside of that envelope, then it behooves us to go back and redefine the envelope and then reassess the item itself. Now, how the item interacts with the weapon system and that Swiss cheese approach, I guess, to firing an arrow through all the holes of the Swiss cheese layers, which I think Hadden Cave refers to, it is a complex issue, and that's something to be thought about.
I think we're the same, and we do adopt a system of systems approach. You'll be aware of the first, second party assurance that we do, and the second party assurance being the Ordnance Safety Review Panel and the assurance that we get. So for a complex weapon, and take an air launch weapon, for instance, it doesn't just stop there. Of course, there's the integration onto the aircraft and all of the trials and supporting evidence that you need for that. But in addition to that, there's a requirement for an air launch weapon release certificate, which further looks at safety case arguments and evidence before that thing's actually hung off an aircraft. And of course, they'll be looking at thermal effects, air carriage, vibration analysis, and all the rest of it. So it's more than just the explosive elements of it. It's the whole system. And it's the system, when it's on the aircraft, as you'll be aware, the vibration analysis on one pylon on the aircraft will be different to an inboard pylon, and different between different aircraft as well. So most of the disapplications we have from the legal requirements in the UK is dependent upon us of having a scheme, and that scheme is pretty much everything that I presented first thing this morning. It involves a lot of things.
Just a quick point from the legal perspective. There was a case in New South Wales under health and safety laws that looked at this in some context around risk management, around this idea that when you have systems of systems and multiple systems operating at once, as part of the risk management approach, you need to be thinking about what if scenarios in catastrophic failure type contexts. And if people are interested in the citation, it's a case involving Bulga underground coal. And the judge basically said, you've got to think about those what if contexts. So things like bow tie analysis to go through catastrophic scenarios that pick up the systems of systems and that complexity is really important in making sure that we're subjecting our risk analysis and safety arguments to that additional scrutiny for catastrophic risks.
Yeah, this one's for Elena. It's more of a legal question around credibility of risk. So we go through our hazard analysis and we identify contextualised hazards. And when we go into a risk assessment, we try and cull the volume of work so we don't do a million what ifs. We try and work out what is a credible failure mode or a hazard that would be experienced within our area of use or the way we use the item. How does that work from a legal standpoint when I say a contextualised hazard is incredible? That's my subjective opinion. This is something that affects a lot of our stars, and we like to talk about this quite a bit as to whether or not we think something's credible or incredible. And that's great from our navel-gazing perspective, and we sign documents. But I'm a bit worried about in the future when someone wants to come tear strips off us and we've said something is incredible because it's bad consequence, really low probability. How will that stand up in a case of law?
Well, you're only going to be judged on that when something's gone wrong and the specific circumstance has been realised, right? So you only have to worry about it then. And that's a little bit of a facetious answer for you, right? I'm being a bit funny on purpose. You can, the meteorite falling out of the sky kind of scenario and whether you really need to put controls in place. Well, the reality is you have to think about all of the hazards of risks in the work, right? And put controls in place so far as reasonably practicable. So, and you're allowed to prioritise, right? So, but in part of dealing with that prioritisation, you really want to be focused on catastrophic risk. And my definition of catastrophic risk is probably different from yours in complexity, but I'm going to give you the definition from my perspective because it's the court's perspective. Catastrophic risk being, fatal risk, right? So when you're dealing with EO management, we're talking about fatal risk left, right and centre, right? So, you've got to prioritise these things. I don't want you to be stupid about it, but you can't dismiss it out of hand and not look at it, right? But it might be different what you're going to be doing for what are the reasonably practical measures and the prioritisation of about what you put in place. Yeah, and look, the risk matrix is the least important part from the legal perspective. I don't know if you noticed in my presentation earlier, I didn't talk about the risk matrix at all, because guess what the legal requirements say about, where you fit. Guess what prosecutions look at about where you've ended up evaluating that risk on a risk matrix. I've read every single prosecution that's been in the health and safety space in this country. I know I'm a sad person, but it never comes up. It literally never comes up. The question is always, did you identify the hazards in the work? Did you identify the risk? Did you put in place reasonably practical controls? That's what the conversation is always about. So we need to be making sure that we are really asking a question of, have we done what is reasonably practical in setting up that safe system of work? And the conversations that we go into on the esoterics of risk evaluation is actually all beside the point from my perspective as a lawyer. I know it's not particularly helpful too.
Okay, there was a mention about name dropping this morning, but I have actually spoken to Sir Charles Haddon Cave on this, and he's always said that if you've covered all that was reasonably expected to happen and you've conducted a robust risk assessment, he as a High Court judge would back you all of the way. So I think if you made an assessment of incredible likelihood, and for whatever reason that proved wrong, if at the time it was thought that your judgment that you used was sound, then I suppose that you would be okay on that. We can't get it right all of the time. It is a risk assessment at the end of the day. Sure.
So just to draw a line under that, you're going to need to be able to defend that decision. And it's going to be hard to do 10 years' time if you didn't write it down, right? Okay.
Just a consideration on the on where you're focusing, perhaps a bow tie analysis, if that's the tool you're typically using, rather than that risk event being a very large, loud explosion somewhere. Pick a couple of precursor conditions or failure modes that are indicative of an impending catastrophic activity, unless you put in some recovery actions. And certainly from an aviation perspective, a lot of our approach and work is catching things, a range of things we could do in a preventative sense, but then there'll be, it might be battle damage, it might be any number of things that cause you to actually reach a condition that is unchecked, will take you somewhere you don't want to be. So there's certainly worth identifying some of those precursor conditions and running your bow tie around those ones. Give yourself the best chance of recovering it before it goes all the way.
My question is not to Elena, but I'd be interested in your thoughts after the other gentlemen have had a say. I'm Michael Netherton, I'm from the University of Newcastle, and I'm a structural engineer. Within the Australian standards, they list for an explosion from a liquid petroleum gas event in a container, they specifically state that an acceptable level of the risk of death is 1 in a million. I also note that the New South Wales government say that from any industrial process, they will accept a risk of death to the Joe public of 1 in a million. For a worker bee inside that area, it's 1 times 10 to the minus 5. So I was curious that when you say a risk matrix is not considered, where does the legal WHS sit, or your perspective sit, with arguments like 1 in a million is acceptable? Is that a reasonable number? Who defines that that number is reasonable or not?
See what they just did there? They were like, nah, it's all yours, mate. Legal question. But you know what I like about that? That is a little demonstration of competent person in action, right? Like, I like that. Deferring to expertise, yeah. Look, in Australia, and I want to give this as an Australian legal context, we have decided as a society that we do not accept risk of death as part of this framework, right? We have to eliminate and minimise health and safety risks so far as reasonably practical and keep people safe. And in fact, that societal expectation has tracked through in the fact that we don't accept death as part of our policy and procedure, and the leadership position that I've seen from defence group heads and service chiefs, that death in our work is just not accepted. The fact that that might sit in engineering standards, those standards typically haven't reflected on the legal paradigm that is in the WHS Act, but it's simply not acceptable under the WHS Act. And if you want some evidence of that, if you look at some of the Safe Work Australia interpretive guidelines about what is reasonably practicable in the circumstances, it basically says if you can't afford to put the control measures in place to keep people safe, get out of it, get out of the operational area that you're talking about. It says that if there are facial risks and you're going to not implement controls because it's too expensive, well, that's insufficient to be considered that grossly disproportionate to the risk aspect of the reasonable practicability definition. So all of that is going to this point of we don't accept tolerability of death. And in fact, that risk tolerability whole conversation is just not in the WHS legal framework, which might be there in other legal frameworks outside of Australia, and that is also part of the context that we're dealing with because we are operating in an international context here, but we have a specific Australian context as well. I know that was a very broad-ranging response.
Yeah, so maybe before we get the international view, because I think it is subtly different, I think the difference is a proactive versus a reactive risk approach, right? And so under the law now, we have to take a proactive risk approach. Now I get it, I'm an engineer, I get it, that having a standard to strive for is a very useful tool. But the bit we've got to add on to this, and this is the work that we're doing in DOS2, to figure out how do we square wanting to reach in and use some international standards as our benchmark, if you like, but we still have a legal obligation to be able to demonstrate that if we've chosen to do that, it does in fact represent a minimisation so far as reasonably practicable. So it's not about meeting an arbitrary number. And the danger with picking arbitrary numbers and the minimum standards approach is that's all you do. And it's easy with those really small numbers to convince yourself that you're there. And you can do some clever science and some clever maths and you can convince yourself you're there. And with the space shuttle examples, salient lessons in that. So the proactive approach and the work we've got to do is figure out how do we bring those standards that oftentimes are still written in that, outcome, minimum standard type approach. How do we bring that in and use it in a proactive way? And the way I think we do it is we start with that, but then we do the extra bit of work to show why we can't do more, why it's not reasonable to do more. Oh, sorry, because as you said, the academic exercise of saying it's 1 in a million becomes exactly that, academic, in court.
This example's probably out of date, so I dare say they may well have moved on, but I remember causing chaos in the US in a flight test program at one point because we terminated a sortie and came back reporting a serious incident, and our colleagues went very quiet that we were working with and sort of scurried away, and we didn't really understand why, and it was because they were tangled up very much in definitions and numbers and metrics. So, the numbers will be not quite accurate, but it was something like serious incident in their language was up to $10 million and 5 deaths or something, and that was then they had an accident, and that was obviously worse. So it got very distracting, and as indicated, sort of picking a number is not really going to get you to where you'd need to be, which is eliminating wherever possible.
So the one thing I do like about this particular line of work we're all in is that we are a group of many, many different types of specialists. For instance, you know, whilst I've observed and been involved in explosive ordnance disposal, I'm not one of those specialists. And risk assessment is one of those where we rely upon subject matter experts, SQEP people, competent people in order to gather that information. One of the things I do find as a regulator when I'm reading explosive safety cases is when people start talking about 1 in a million or 10 to the minus 9 or 10 to the minus 6 or whatever. What exactly are they talking about? You know, I've traveled, I don't know, 20,000 miles or so to get here. You know, add that to my age and the distance to my hotel, you'll come up with a figure. But the data is totally sort of unrelated. So for us in the UK, we have a document called R2P2, and I don't know if you're aware of that, but that sets the legal standard that we're expected to observe. So R2P2 stands for Reducing Risks, Protecting People. You can Google it and have a read of it, but that sets the limits of tolerability within the UK that is the minimum standard we're expected to observe. So when I look at an explosive safety case and people start quoting figures like that to me, all I'm looking to ensure is that, first of all, they're meeting the minimum legal requirements. And that document was put together by our health and safety executive from an older document, which was managing risks associated with nuclear power stations. That's where we are.
I'm not aware of an accepted societal risk within Canada. And despite the department's or our minister's exemption from the Explosives Act, the occupational health and safety principles would still apply. And I think it would behoove us to demonstrate on paper how we got to SFARP and how we came to make that particular decision at that moment in time with the information we had in hand. And that's the best we can do, I think. And if the situation or circumstance changes, it behooves us to go back to that assessment and revise it, basically.
I'd like to answer that question. I'm Roger from DST, also a structural engineer. 1 in 1 million is adopted by the civilian industry, especially for the aircraft, civilian aircraft. But in the weapon designing, this is not always the case. For example, for the rocket, it's not 1 to 1 million, it's often 1 to 1,000. That's determined. For example, if we design a rocket case, we have to decide what's the maximum expected operation pressure. This pressure is taken out of the 3 sigma of the test curve of the combustion pressure of the normal size. Then you plus 3 sigma, which is 3 standard deviation. So this gives you 1 to 1,000. So currently, it is worked into 1 to 1,000, not 1 to 1 million. Thanks.
I would caution against use of numbers and 1 in 1,000, 1 in 10, 1 in a million, because at the end of the day, it's all circumstantial, and it depends on what information you had at hand. And I think the numbers game may not be that influential in the decision at the end of the day.
I totally agree with you. Engineering, we always talk about the 3 sigma or 6 sigma. So we use the 3 sigma. But if we talk to the ordinary people, you tell them it's 3 sigma, you have to explain in very long sentence what this 3 sigma means. So 1 to 1 million is well recognized, easy to accept. That's all. Nothing else. So 3 sigma is engineering term. 1 to 1,000 is easily accepted by everybody.
Good afternoon. Sorry to drone on about likelihood and consequence. This is a question for the Alina, a legal question. I was wondering whether maybe life was a lot easier for the Commonwealth and EO being pretty much a Commonwealth domain, drawing on other aspects of the law where the Commonwealth is expected to be like a model litigant and a model contractor. Is perhaps the standard to which the Commonwealth held a little bit higher, particularly when defining what is reasonably practical? That's to say, the Commonwealth is not in a position to argue it didn't have the resources or the cash to fund the mitigation. So really, and this ties into consequence and likelihood, consequence is always catastrophic, generally speaking. So we're talking about likelihood, which is the question of exposure. So it could be a case that the longer you have to fix a mitigation, the more you are obliged to fix it. So then the question is perhaps just, given the time, did you do something about it? And then having to defend that position rather than a simple resource question per se. So you have a schedule question and then a resource question. And is the Commonwealth treated any differently than, say, a company or other PCBUs?
Thanks for the question. It's a good one. And you're right in this sense. There is I'm a fabulous lawyer, by the way, in case you weren't already aware of that fact. But what I'll tell you is this: there is absolutely no way I would stand up in any court for defence arguing that it wasn't reasonably practicable for us on the basis of the resourcing position. It will not fly as an argument for a defence, even as fabulous as a defence lawyer I am, right? Why is that? You're the Commonwealth of Australia. There is absolutely no way you don't have sufficient resources. If you don't have sufficient resources, who does? And where the court goes is says, well, it's a matter for you to sort yourselves out. The fact that you haven't sorted yourself out on time, resourcing in terms of personnel and dealing with all of the pressures, the silos, all of that stuff, well, that just means you haven't done enough to put reasonably practicable measures in place to create safe systems of work. And that is on you. And you need to create those systems in light of the context that you've got, right? So those sorts of arguments just will not wash when it comes to court. But can I say something else about reasonably practicable measures? And it kind of goes to something Nigel was saying. When we do get in trouble and we've got prosecutions, it's not in this complex systems sort of space with these kind of esoteric conversations that we're having. They're really simple areas that we're just failing to deal with, right, on really tangible matters. So failing to put in place the specific mandatory controls that are listed in regulations around what are reasonably practical measures for working at height, for example. You know, they're listed in the regulations. So when it comes to designing and doing the work around identifying the hazards and risks and working out, you know, where we get the evidence for creating the safety argument, are we actually going and doing the information gathering exercise that we need to around what are mandatory controls? Because if we just did that on mandatory controls, we'd be a bunch further than we are at the moment. And the law says what's reasonably practicable for, you know, those hazards and risks that turn up all the time.
Jill's we've got time for 2 more questions, I think, and then we'll call it a wrap.
It's an observation. We've got 3 regulators sitting at the table and the world's fabulous lawyer, just listen to her. I've heard today in all the presentations about, from a regulatory system, losing direction a little from all of us. And, you know, US aren't here, but I know they'd say a similar thing. Losing direction, then getting direction back, getting the measures of effectiveness right, getting the people right. Now, how do you, observation from all of you, how are we going to stop getting back into that cycle of the next rationalisation program, the next whatever happens within our military organisations that take the resources away, or even if it's just an ageing workforce where we lose sweat people amongst the regulators? What do you see as your priorities to keep yourselves as credible, informed regulators? Because all of the questions you've got here in this session have been about seeking guidance on what do I do next. So we can't put out rules on everything, but how do you keep yourselves informed to what do I do next?
If I understood the question correctly, I think it's keeping safety in mind. And I think the Nimrod case was a good example where it went from safety to business, and they lost that safety perspective. And if we keep reminding ourselves about why we're doing what we're doing, it is to ensure safety. And if we can keep that as our baseline, then I think we're doing good. I'm not sure if that answers the question, but I think it's keeping that in mind, and that is the center of gravity that we need to maintain. How will I do that in Canada? By working the culture as much as I can, by ensuring that everything we do is directly associated with safety and not business planning or finances or resources. There will be some constraints and challenges associated with those issues, but I need to highlight them to my senior leadership and then do what I can within the context of do what I can with what I have, but always keeping safety as my center of gravity and trying to protect that as much as possible. And where I fail to do so, I need to highlight that to my chain of command so they can make the decisions they need to make to support me in where we need to go. And I think that's as much as I can do.
I think for the obvious answer is leadership. And for us, it comes from the Secretary of State for Defence, who has issued a policy statement on what is expected for safety within the Ministry of Defence. That flows down to the frontline commands, and it flows down to the Defence Safety Authority through a charter that he's issued to us. So you talked about organisational change and how that's managed. We've learned from that as well, and that was one of the key findings within Haddon Cave was there was too much organisational change without assessing the impact of that change. So we have a process called the Organisational Safety Assessment, and whenever there is change proposed, and for instance, we're separating our submarine project team away from the Defence Equipment and Support and creating a submarine delivery body. There's lots of other change going on within the Navy Command, certainly within the Air Force and within the Army as well. But within my own organisation, the Defence Safety Authority, I showed you our program PRISM. We have an organisational safety assessment which is looking at the way that we manage safety today, the way we used to manage safety, the way we propose to manage it through this organisational change. And that's then peer reviewed by the Defence Safety Committee, and it makes sure that you've considered all of this, that nothing in terms of safety is going to drop through the cracks because you're going to change in the way you've done it.
Yeah, good question. Thanks, Jackie. So I think here in Australia, the journey we've been on this last 3 years or so, we've been wrestling with that exact question. And General Mulhall hit it this morning when he said that safety, and particularly explosive safety, doesn't exist in isolation. So some of the conversations that we've been having outside of defence has been with people in the oil and gas industry, and what that illustrated to me was that in business, safety is actually seen as an enabler, and that money invested in safety is seen as an investment. So that's why we've come down a path, certainly make sure that people understand that explosive safety is absolutely relevant, and we explain why that is. And as I've said, that's sometimes a little tougher for us in Australia because we haven't had those big accidents that we can reach back to. But it's also breaking down this notion that that there's a tension between safety and capability. In fact, safety, and particularly explosive safety, I think, is a capability enabler, and certainly the absence of safety is a liability. It's going to detract from capability. So it's not I'll be safe or I'll achieve an operational effect. It's got to be both. And I think what Brendan briefed demonstrated that is part of the DNA already in some parts of defence, and it's taking that and mapping it more broadly. So I am embracing the financial piece, but in a very careful way to show that money invested in safety is actually an investment, and if we invest that money wisely, we can end up saving ourselves money, right, and reinvesting it into the operations. But there is a floor cost that can't come for free, and we're going to have to invest in it. But it doesn't exist in its own little silo, and we can't just get together every 2 years and talk about it. We've got to just make it part of our business and demystify explosive safety somewhat, so it's not just the esoteric conversations for the clever folks. It's actually just part of routine business because, hey, we're a defence force. We use explosives.
I think your last point there about normalising the organisation's approach to it. So explosive safety isn't the domain of just the experts that are dealing with it. It belongs to a whole bunch of us whether it's from a command perspective or latent victims who happen to be in the frag envelope because of something that's been done incorrectly and has got away from someone. So I think that's probably, I mentioned that I didn't have a huge amount of exposure or experience with ordnance management apart from the confines of what my aircraft used to operate when we could afford them. And that's a telling point. Who's to say 5-10 years from now that we don't end up in another financial black hole? We embark on another. When you mentioned strategic defence reform and everything that Air Force went through, as did the other services to a degree, with our downsizing, we certainly felt exposed in that respect in terms of loss of expertise and loss of resources from a people and time perspective, with the same output required. So it's certainly something we need to remain alert to. Difficult to plan for in terms of, yes, we're going to do this, we're going to end up with this massive economic downturn, but I think culture, if we keep ourselves alive to the concept that it is just one aspect of safety and one subset of controls that we're applying within a broader system, then it's probably the best thing we can do.
Just wanted to add a legal overlay to all of that, and all of that makes perfect sense. As part of the officer due diligence obligation, our leaders, our senior leaders, are required to ensure that there are appropriate resources and processes in place for eliminating and minimising health and safety risks. And resources includes time, people, financial resources. All of that is encapsulated in that concept of resources inside due diligence. So it's really critical that we do those safety impact assessments in the context of strategic change and strategic reform, and those safety impact assessments are being provided to senior leaders as part of their informed decision making, and we need to make sure that we're building that into our assurance mechanisms and our performance reporting processes that link into due diligence arrangements for senior leaders.
All right, I said two more, but I'm going to call it there now because it's 5 o'clock. Please join me in thanking our panel members. There's some cracking questions there and I think some really good answers.